Gives me great pleasure to introduce to all of you, but also it's an old friend for many of you, Tom Buoye, who's an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Tulsa. He's also one of our research associates at the center, and he's a team member, and I find this most interesting, of a project called Legalizing Space in China, which is being conducted at the Institut d'Asie Orientale at ENS or ENS at Lyon in France, which is an international collaborative project to translate the sub-statutes of the Qing dynasty law code. And I'll just say this today is a bit of a Michigan Mafia day. Tom is one of ours. He's a PhD, so we get to see the best and the brightest of our products. I will also say, as a lawyer, I had thought until today's presentation there were only a few people who understood that the great value in Chinese law, whether modern or imperial, was the meaning and construction of the Li part of the Da Qing Lu Li. But I now discovered today that this is Tom's life's work, and I really look forward to this presentation, which will impact upon that and hopefully educate us further as a community. Tom.
Thank you. There's a theory of morphic resonance, so maybe we picked up on your concern.
That's right.
For the Li. Okay, I got to turn this thing on. Am I now? Oh, sounds loud. Okay. I'm on the air. Thank you so much, Nico, for the introduction, and great time we had at dinner last night. Chance to get to know each other. It is just overwhelmingly great pleasure to be back in Ann Arbor, and one could quickly be consumed with nostalgia and probably waste 15 to 20 minutes trying to remember where everything was and recalling things. But I should recall, just briefly, if you'll indulge me, I had a great time, great education here at the University of Michigan, and three people who had a big influence on my education, my career. Unfortunately, two of them are no longer with us. Charles Tilly, who I don't know if the China specialists know, but a very famous sociologist, historian, who I studied with when I first came to Michigan. And Al Feuerwerker, of course, who was the director of the center. And so I thought I could have changed the title, let me see if this works, of my talk, because two things I always remember. One about, Chuck used to talk about what we do in social history is talk about how the little people experience the big changes. And that was one of his lines he used to always use. And for Al, there were many things Al said that we remember. But one thing I remember very, very well early on when I was first a grad student, he introduced his comments by saying, I have several desultory thoughts. And this is before we had phones and dictionaries. What are desultory thoughts? Later we learned. But so I could rename the talk, How the Little People Experience Quandaries of Qing Criminal Justice, Some Desultory Thoughts, in honor of my professors. But that wouldn't make too much sense. But also, one other person I must thank who, fortunately, and I'm very happy to say here in the room, is Ernie Young, too, who's one of my advisors on my dissertation. Thanks, Ernie. Okay, so let me get down to business here. The title is Capital Punishment and Confucian Clemency, in scare quotes, and the Quandaries of Qing Criminal Justice. You'll notice I have a problem with alliteration. My wife, the English professor, is getting a little tired of this, so I may have to quit doing that in the future. And did I go too far? Okay. What I'm going to focus on eventually, after I talk about a few other things, are the requirements for statutory pardons in the Qing Code. And, okay, now I got one screen here. Okay, the other screens went out. And there are two which I'm putting under this heading of Confucian Clemency. And there was a law that granted clemency if you killed someone while you were defending your parents from an attack. And the one I really want to focus on today, though, is remaining home to care for relatives. This is a bit more complicated than the first sub-statute, and I'll spend more time talking about that. But before I do that, let me just give the context. I'm a historian, so I'm hopelessly involved in giving context. The 18th century in China, I hope no one's going to dispute me on these because this is just a brief intro. But we know population doubled, commercialization of the economy, all these things created prosperity, but also extreme poverty. There were real extremes in the 18th century economy. You can see this if you look at disputes over property and land. migration, resettlement. All these things had positive impacts, but also very disruptive. And clearly also an increase in individual and collective violence. There's an article by Chenjer Wei and two other scholars whose names I can't recall, I apologize, in the most recent issue of all places, Explorations in Economic History, that has attempted to quantify this. And they spent a lot of time digging through the archives, the #1 archives, looking at not just homicide case records, but other sources too, to try to do a quantitative analysis of violence. I don't agree with everything they say in this article, but one thing is a steady increase in violence in the 18th century. They also talk about decline in the 19th century, which I think has more to do with the sources, but we won't get into that. So accompanying all this is a crackdown on crime, okay, by in the Qing, at least in the 18th century. Now, to get to Nico's question, sub-statutes, okay. Now, the thing about the Qing Code, too, it's a moving target. It depends on what year you look at, and every 5 years after the 5th year of Qianlong, they would have revisions of the sub-statutes. You'll find a different number of li, all right, the Tiao Li. So if you go back to the original Ming Code, there's only 382. By Shunzhi, there's 449. Now, this is misleading too. Yongzhong, the number is 824 in 1725, but that was the first time they really decided to try to compile everything in one place. So things have been added and over the course of the Kangxi reign too, but nobody pulled it all together, tried to systematize it. So that could be a little deceptive. It's not as if just doubling in the Yongzhong reign. But in Qianlong's reign, things really start to take off. There are more li. And I didn't translate this part. But in Qianlong 44, there's interesting order from the Xingbu, which just says, it's the li that matter, really. Use the li, don't use the law. There's so many li underneath these law that the original laws, in some cases, don't make any sense anymore. This is what you were saying. The Tiao Li are the most important part. Now, I'm going to talk about crime, but some of these Tiao Li, for example, during the Yongzhong reign, they're a different type of li, and this is the imperial decreed lis, and they were on some of these big policies that we know about during the Yongzhong reign. Some people don't usually talk about this, but these were put into the law code too. The taxation, clearly with all that income disparity in the 18th century, the Yongzhong emperor realized tax reform was necessary. I mean, a middle-class tax cut was probably the solution here. Emancipation of the mean people and the changes in how minorities were governed in Southwest China. These were all imperial decreed li. Now, more mundane matters, and these I'm more familiar with from my own research on property right disputes, are criminalization of rent default. That's a law. And that appears early in the Qianlong reign. Now, I'm going to talk about this more, but I put the Chinese there too because it's important. Just defaulting on your rent isn't the crime. It's if you're the crafty and obstinate tenant who defaults on his rent, okay? So you may default on your rent and not be punished, but if you're crafty and obstinate, then you should be punished. Something even more simple, we're setting limits on redemptions of land sales. And again, it's not a topic I want to get into detail here, but the dianmai, right? There were laws that just said what the limits were, time limits on those things were. And again, I think it's a reaction to the kinds of disputes that were occurring over property rights and land. So I'd like to sum all this up as a legislative turn in Qing rule, this huge number of new laws that are being added in the 18th century. And what's it all about? These are more questions than answers here, but is more law better law? Well, if you start to look at individual laws, you'll see they're constantly being worked on, and modified and changed. And it's another other issue like any kind of legislation is it's great to write laws, but who's going to implement them? That's a problem too, oftentimes. But there's also this sort of legal tinkering that you see going on. And I stole that word from Kent Guy. He talks about the provincial administration in the Qing and how it was a process of tinkering with the administrative rules. I think the same thing's going on here in all kinds of laws. And then the problem of just trying to maintain principles that underlie the criminal justice, this is what I want to talk about more today, versus putting law into practice, and the practical problems you run into. So the questions then too were, is this more sophisticated law code, or is it a more balanced approach to crime? And I think one time I even asked, is this modernization? But it's probably not a good question to ask today. So what are the quandaries of Qing criminal justice? Well, they try to put them in several categories here. Once you start increasing the number of capital crimes and identifying more crimes, obviously you have more work, more costs. Some of it's administrative and financial. That involves policing, incarceration, transportation of criminals when they're going into exile. That's a real cost. There's judicial and political quandaries that arise from just what you might normally expect in a complex bureaucracy. The people at the grassroots level may not necessarily perceive the crime, the laws, the same way folks up above them do. And that's a constant problem that I'll talk about a little bit more too. The center, really the Xingbu, but really more the emperor too. And Qianlong, for one, is very vocal about his own disappointment he has with the criminal justice system. And then there's procedural or institutional issues too that are going to arise because of how criminal, especially capital cases, are adjudicated, how they're sentenced, how they're reviewed. So the more capital crimes, the more effort you put into trying to deter serious crime, you create greater burdens here. Now the ideological I'm going to leave because we'll get into that in more detail. Simple things, just a matter, where are these people who are being jailed while they're awaiting final sentencing in capital crimes? Well, most of them are being held in county jails where they committed these crimes. So we got to feed them, you got to give them clothing, there's laws about that. And suddenly we see, not suddenly, but you can find many requests for additional funds to build, I don't want to say prisons, jails, because incarceration is not a punishment. You'll see these in Jupizoja, and you'll also see sometimes in Shinkotiban for the Hubu. They're requesting more funds to pay for these things, okay? And when people are sent into exile, when their sentences are deferred or reduced, particularly when they're sent to what literally is the malarial areas, meaning Guangxi province and areas of Guangdong. Well, like the Guangxi provincial governor is suddenly got a whole bunch of criminals on his hands that he has to take care of, and he needs more grain to feed them. So these are all costs. Transporting, now, when people have their sentences reduced, they're going to be put into exile. So you have to escort these criminals or convicts. There's escapes. And by the middle of the Qianlong reign, we start sending exiles into Xinjiang. And that turns out to be very expensive. Interestingly enough, a lot of criminals would rather run away than move to Xinjiang. So you have to track them down, you have to arrest them. And then who's responsible for all these exiles when they end up? Now, the internal exiles the punishments are based on distances from your home area. So there's a whole chart. Frédéric Constant, French scholar, has done a paper on this. If you're here, you go where? If you're in Michigan, I'm just making this up now, you get sent to Iowa or something, or Minnesota, you go to Nebraska. This is the kind of thing it was. It's a matter of what the distance is. Well, then there's a community of exiled criminals in your district. Who's supposed to be watching these people? Now, there's not a lot of good information on that, but I could find homicides that get committed amongst these communities, and one of the questions they're asking up above, besides the question about the crime, is who's watching these people? And who's responsible for them? Incarceration in jail, awaiting a final sentence for a capital crime. Sometimes you'll see documents that talk about people have been deferred, had their sentence deferred 5 times. There's another situation which is 10 times without being checked off, which means a criminal's been found guilty in 10 successive years at the Autumn Assizes, but the emperor didn't check his name off. So he comes back into the Autumn Assizes again the next year. What's happening to these people? Well, people are dying in the jails. And this is just names of a couple of poor fellas here who died in their local jails awaiting some final sentence. So they're in a local jail waiting a final sentence. Now, the longest one I found was 24 years. So he'd been through the Autumn Assizes 24 times, beginning in the Yongjong reign, and he finally died in the local jail without having his sentence finalized. So he was a huanzhi. Now, 3 times, 5 times. You can also, if you search these databases for death in prison, or death in jail, I should say, you'll find people who obviously, died within a short period of time. And especially in violent crimes, they're going to be in very poor. Oftentimes, they've been beaten up or they've been wounded. That's not surprising. But the other thing that I found surprising was that people are surviving in local jails for quite a number of years, and their cases have not been resolved. Okay, so what about the political issues? I'm going to get to the ideological one, but this involves the emperor and all layers of the bureaucracy, because any capital crime has to be reviewed from the ground up. And one of the issues, very politically incorrect he was, the Qianlong emperor, he mocked officials who were too lenient and called it the benevolence of women. It's an old phrase. You look that up, you'll find it going way back into Chinese history. He didn't invent that phrase himself. And what he's saying then is that his provincial officials, he's usually focusing his attention on them, are being too lenient. Why do we have all these people who have not been finally sentenced? Well, part of it is because they won't, they won't find these people guilty, qingshi, which is facts found in the case. Of course, Qianlong himself is not checking them off. That's another question, but we won't go into that. And what Qianlong complains about, that people twist the facts in order to gain leniency for criminals, that this undermines the law. And he's also very upset that local officials, or the provincial officials, are more concerned about their own reputation, and they don't have respect for the imperial prerogative. Only the emperor should have the power to demonstrate this leniency and benevolence in capital crimes. So he often would write rescripts that went with the annual Autumn Assizes, and there's several here where he attacks the provincial officials for being too lenient. There's one I found in the Qingshi Lu where he goes after Chen Homeng, and he says, look at these criminals. He's not sentencing to death here. These are all serious crimes, and this is a mistake. So clearly, at least at some points, Qianlong was very, very paying a lot of attention to how this whole review process went. This is just a brief, I guess, overview here of the way the judicial review works. When a crime's committed, the local county magistrate's responsible for collecting all the evidence, filing the reports, taking depositions, basically creating the whole case record, including the medical examination of the homicide of the victim, and then all that material gets forwarded up the line through the prefecture to the province to the emperor, and that's the process that's going to establish guilt or innocence. And what we can find in the archives, of course, are the complete documents. So they all look like they went through step by step. Cases could get sent back at any level, but you won't see that in that kind of record. Now, sentencing is another matter. So once your case goes through that whole process, there's 2 broad categories, and one is this lidre, your immediate execution, but it's not immediate. Okay, some people translate it as imminent, and I myself used to cite a reference from Chu Dongshu, where he said, yeah, immediate execution means that they will be executed after the Autumn Assizes. Now I've found enough cases where they weren't, and years later they still haven't been executed, to say that that's not the case. It really, really depends on individual cases. But the big number of most of these cases would be imprisoned, awaiting the final decision at the Autumn Assizes. So, and that would then come under that heading of Quandary, okay? And that's the problem. So if you look at these registers of the confessions, sometimes some people call them confession registries, these are the lists of the summaries of the cases that are going to go through the autumn assizes. The overwhelming majority are going to be Quandary cases. How long have they been going through this system? You don't know unless you look at the document in a given year. You can do that because the Mormon History Library in Utah had, years ago in the 80s, microfilmed the Choshin Dangan. So you can go there and get some of these and look at they're online, but it's difficult. There's some things you click on a button and it says you can only look at them if you're a Mormon. So I have yet to convert for my research. But most of the decision making is going to be about deferred cases. So why are they churning through the system for so long? Well, if you read some of the background documents, de facto what's happening is being jailed is really going to be your punishment, right? And you can see this implied in some of the discussions of the sentencing. But it becomes such a burden because every year they're sending these back. So by this point, 1758, the reason why I have these numbers, there's a communication here where they're saying, like, look, okay, you don't need to send the complete dossier on every case anymore. Just a short summary will do because they're going to keep churning through the system. There's too much paper. And you can find, if you just these days Google around through the Qingshi Lu or other sources, references to these complaints going back even to Kangxi. There's too many criminals under indefinite stay. 1765 is interesting because, and they just use the term 10,000, so I don't take that as an exact figure. But in that year, they complain that there's over 10,000 cases that are unresolved. Now, from another source, you can find a list of people who were actually executed that year, which is 2,863. So if there's 10,000 plus 12,000 that were executed, I guess 2/3 of them, if my math is correct, are still churning through the system year after year. So this is a problem and this is just a statistic on numbers of criminals who were executed in those given years, and those years are there because there were sources for those years. But the numbers ranging between roughly 2,200 to 3,300 seem to be, if you take population into account, not changing that much. And yet you have all these other cases that are just languishing in this category of Quandary. Now, go back when you read the Qing Katiba, which have these narratives of crime, and believe me, I've read many of these things. You can understand these principles of leniency that you'll see talked about in these handbooks and guides for the Qing officials. Everybody cites this one because it's been translated in English, so it's the easiest one to get at. But Huang Liuhong talks about this too. If there's one iota of reason for a suspect to be exonerated, the magistrate must explore that point to mitigate the punishment. So we're not trying to be hanging judges, right? We're trying to find ways to seek leniency when we can. That's what Chen Long complains about, right? The benevolence of women. And another thing is, it's translated as inducement, but the interesting thing here is it's only applicable to ignorant country simpletons, okay? So that what he says there is that some criminals don't realize that a magistrate will help you to get a reduced sentence if you just, confess to the crime and cooperate with them. So it's clear, and it's clearly a part of the practice here, okay? So to look at this, go back to what I originally started with, is these ideological dilemmas. There's a concern for human life, on the one hand, that you can find references to in the Qing dynasty and other earlier periods. You can go all the way back to the Zhou dynasty and find statements about being cautious about using capital punishment. But then we have this problem in the 18th century is we're increasing the number of death penalty eligible crimes because we want to crack down and deter crime. So how do we preserve some of these Confucian principles that are in the law and yet also restore social order here? part of it is they're going to be redefining what criminal behavior is, or who is a criminal, okay? Or what type of person is this criminal. So if you go back to the Sacred Edict of Kangxi, which I recommend everybody should do, you'll find the 16 maxims, and number 8 is explain the laws to warn the ignorant and obstinate. So ignorant and obstinate, key term, right? This is sort of the attitude towards crime, right? Who commits crimes? The stupid people, the simpletons, the country simpletons, or people who are just obstinate, right? Now, traditionally, we look at those folks and we say, well, they could be changed, right? They could be educated. And so this is a more benign look, I don't know, criminal behavior. So you'll find the terms used in the law, too. This is not just part of the Sacred Edict. So that there's one of the laws on rape says if a woman is shamed by somebody who's making an untoward advance toward her, and she commits suicide, well, if it's just one of these ignorant rustic, which is maybe, I don't know, the same term here as the country simpletons, but ignorant rustic who did not have intent to rape. So if it's just some stupid guy in the countryside who said something dumb, he shouldn't be executed for that, right? And then in that law I brought up before about the rent defaults, it's only applicable to if you're the obstinate tenant who's not paying his rent, right? So we use these terms in the law, and this fits in with this idea about education or converting people through education. So then by the time we get to the Yongjung period, we don't want to just legislate and create new laws. We also want to propagate the laws. And in the Yongjung amplification of the Sacred Edict, he says this is to reach out to the ignorant rustics, okay? So we got to get this law out there. And the commentaries in that work, and that's been translated into English. Of course, it's kind of funky 19th century English, but it's nice. You can search it and have the Chinese and the English side by side. But these commentaries, not just for maxim number 8, but for all the maxims, also attempt to explain them in relationship to the law. So here's the idea, which is, if we could just explain to these ignorant rustics what they're doing wrong here, and show them the law, maybe they'll behave better, right? This is a good thing. And Chen Lung was on board with this, right? He talks about conducting the lecture with enthusiasm, okay? And there's also something I translated as proclamation pavilions, the Shenming Ting, and you'll find that in the Qing Code too. There's only one sub-statute on that. The law itself goes back to the Ming. It's in the Ming Code. And the only sub-statute is about destroying these things. But you can read about them I've read about one in this Jupizoja, which talks about how you should set these up. Basically, you're shaming people because you're set up in these pavilions, lists of people who committed crimes and what they did wrong. So you shame them, plus you educate the public. And also, it's a way to introduce people to the laws. So I don't think they were very effective. You don't see many references to them after the later Qianlong period. But this is part of the idea, right? We can educate these ignorant and obstinate people. Well, by the 18th century, though, we got another category of criminal behavior. So we got the ignorant and we got the obstinate. But now we have more sub-statutes being added that address this bear stick. Okay, I'm just using the literal translation here. The Guanggun. And who is a Guanggun? What is a Guanggun? It's got lots of different meanings, right? Modern day, in the past, it's often construed to be these poor, downwardly mobile males. But I think it includes them, but it's more, probably the better translation is blatant criminals or flagrant violators, okay? Because it also, in some of these laws, it includes people who clearly are not downwardly mobile males. And here's a list of the bear sticks sub-statutes from the Qing Code. And you'll notice, like under wrongful taking in daytime, using intimidation to obtain property, and fornication, there are more of these laws. And what they say really is just that here's a law, a sub-statute defining a crime, and what it says, the reason why it's called it Guanggun Li, is there, it just says if the perpetrator is a Guanggun, then they should be punished more severely. So that's usually about the whole extent of the reference to the Guanggun. But if you take something like monopolizing markets, that is not about downwardly mobile peasants by any stretch of the imagination. So it's more about defining another category of criminals who must be punished. Okay. So this is part of our, I'm back to the same thing, ideological dilemmas here of the criminal justice, now that we've decided we're going to crack down on crime and define more capital crimes. Now, the other part of that is tightening requirements for statutory pardons. And that's what I was going to talk about at my original topic here. I'm going to finish up with this then. And what we also see over the course of the 18th century is this tightening of requirements for statutory pardons. So you can find in a lot of these reports of capital crimes ways that these narratives in these reports are being shaped, if you will, by the local officials who control the content to help influence leniency and make people appear less culpable. But these are actual statutory pardons. The first one is pretty simple. If you are defending your parents or grandparents from an attack and you kill somebody, then you should be eligible for a pardon. Now, there's only 3 sub-statutes on that law, and you could read them very quickly and figure it out. What they did do, though, was because obviously in a rural society in the 18th century, when a fight gets started, you're probably likely to be there with the other male members of your family. So it'd be easy to exploit this situation, right? You could claim somebody struck your father first. So they come up with some conditions. You know, was it spontaneous? Okay, or was the parent instigating the son to attack this other person? Was the parent really in danger? So if you can say that they're in the grasp of somebody, or they've been struck with a weapon, or they're bleeding at the time the son intervenes, then we're fine. That they should get their pardon. Now, so the circumstances of the crime are very important here, and if you've got witnesses and a good report, you can sort this out. But yet we have 3 new laws. Now, the other thing, though, is this remaining home to care for your relatives. This is, I wrote an article about this. I called them filial felons, back with the alliteration. But these are people who committed crimes, serious crimes, capital crimes, but they're the only sons of aged parents. Okay, so they should be pardoned. Right? Somebody's got to take care of the parents and carry on the ancestor veneration. Well, that's a little tricky too, right? And over the course of the 18th century, now here's where it depends on what source you're going to look at. A lot of people like the Du Li Cuan, great source. I like it too. It's very, very handy. But if you go back to Wu Tan's commentary, Qing Laws and Sub-Statutes, Notes and Commentary, that was published in 1785, you can compare these two. There are 17 sub-statutes on this type of pardon in the 1905 version of the Du Li Cuan. There were 19 in the 1785. Now, if you read Du Li Cuan, he talks about, okay, this sub-statute used to be 2 or 3, but he doesn't go into great detail. Well, you can compare some of these commentaries and see what was being dropped out when. So by looking at this one, you get a better idea of what's actually going on in the 18th century. And it also includes 6 sub-statutes that were completely deleted from the code during this time. One of the ones that was originally there but then deleted very quickly was, what if you kill your brother? Should you, and there's 2 brothers, and you kill your brother. Should you be allowed to stay home and take care of your parents? No. They decide ultimately no. That's just going to incentivize you to kill your brother. I don't know about you. I would not trust my brother with that law for a minute. But they deleted that one, okay? That's not a good idea to have that law. I forget. I was talking to one of my friends who's a lawyer, and there's a legal term for that. What do you call it? I don't know. Murder. No, yeah, but incentivizing bad behavior or something like, I don't know. They have a legal term for it. Okay, so what's going on here in the 18th century with these 19 sub-statutes? Well, we want to kind of control this pardon, okay? So, and this is, believe me, you can suggest any other terms here too. The relative status of the victim and the killer, external criteria, I'll explain that in a minute too, but things that don't necessarily have anything to do with the crime itself at all. The fairness of it, of the pardon itself, Some crimes are just ineligible for this, no matter what. And then equity or reciprocity between the victim of the crime and the person who might be eligible for pardon. And then you create all kinds of procedural problems with these new sub-statutes. So a relative status. Okay, what if a husband kills his wife and his parents are already deceased? So he has no children. Should he be eligible? So there's no parents to take care of, right? But he's yet to have any children himself. Well, it's okay. He can be granted a pardon under this law if he didn't kill his wife intentionally. Okay, so as long as it wasn't an intentional killing, he's eligible. And then, what if you kill a senior relative? Well, this is interesting too, because obviously there are harsher penalties when you kill a senior relative, right? But there is also, beginning in 1753, there is a law added on the Autumn Assizes which says that if you kill your elder brother or a senior relative, that's a separate listing that goes through the Autumn Assizes differently. And the reason why that is because some of these, the law says you kill a senior relative, you should be executed immediately, right? Lidre. But what if one of the cases I saw was the uncle tells his nephew, hey, I got this new Qigong I've been practicing, I'm invulnerable, punch me in the stomach. So he does, and the guy dies. All right, should he be executed immediately? But that's kind of a silly example, tragic but silly. But I've also found hundreds of these cases where younger brothers kill elder brothers. Which again, my younger brother would probably understand this immediately, but it happens a lot, right? The circumstances are very important then, and they're willing to look at those rather than immediately sentence a person to execution. And I was all set to write a paper about this on a case that I was reading, and then I found out that this person who was sentenced to immediate execution was still alive 3 years later. They were still looking at his case. So what this says then is you cannot automatically be given a pardon to take care of your parents if you kill a senior relative. But all that means is you're going to go into the system, and then you may get a pardon that way, okay? Or you might be delayed, have your sentence delayed for years. Okay, what about some external criteria? There's a law that says bannermen are eligible. It doesn't explain it, doesn't say why, but if you're a Chiren, you're eligible for Liaoyang. I don't know why you wouldn't be, but apparently they felt they had to put it in the law. All right. Another one that's complicated is adopted sons. All right, what if you're an adopted son and you commit a crime, but you're the only son of these aged parents? Can you be given this pardon? And the answer, and this one's complicated. There's changes over the years, and ultimately the answer is no. Okay, you can find somebody else in the clan to take your place, and you can be pardoned. You can be sentenced for your crime. What if you adopted out of your family, killed somebody, and now your parents are alone? Can you go back and take care of them? So that's another issue that they're trying to resolve in these different sub-statutes. And depending on what year you look at, the answer may be yes, the answer may be no, because they're changing it back and forth. What if 2 or more brothers are guilty? Well, that's okay. One of them can be eligible for Liaoyang. So if you and your brother and or brothers commit a capital crime and you're all guilty, one of you can be pardoned to take care of the parents, okay? Now, this is another tricky one. The mother is a chaste widow of 20 years and she's over the age of 50, okay? That was a very controversial one too, if you read the background documents to it when they're discussing it. Because, first of all, they didn't immediately set a time limit or years, like on the age, because for the Liaoyang, your parents should be over 70. I don't think I said that. I should have said that right away. They have to be over 70 and have no other children. But if you're a chaste widow, you got to be chaste. And then, what's your age? Well, they batted that around for a while too, and they finally decided on 50. Now, one of the complaints by some officials was, if your mother's a widow and you're a thug, now you know you can go out and commit any crime you want because you'll get pardoned to take care of your mother. So, we shouldn't allow that. But that's how these, pretty simple, but that's how some of these debates go back and forth. Okay, so these don't involve necessarily what happened in the crime. There are matters that are unrelated to the crime itself. Now, and this is interesting too, because I think the point is that the law is there on the books, right? This comes from the Ming law. The original pardon is there. And they take it seriously. So if you're the only son of aged parents, it says you should be pardoned. Now, what if you're far away from home and you commit a crime in a different province? No, you're no longer eligible, right? Because you're no good anyway. You're an unfilial person. You left your parents alone. Why should we pardon you for your crimes? You've already forgotten your parents. Okay, escaped criminals. You've already committed crimes. Now you kill somebody, and or you commit a capital crime. You're not allowed to be pardoned because you're already a criminal. You've escaped. And then this business of recidivists. What happens if you've been pardoned once? Okay, that's okay. You've been pardoned, but now you commit another crime after you've been pardoned. All right, no good. And then there's a term. There's other terms too. There's a long-standing bandit and crafty thief. If you're one of those, you should not have another chance at a pardon. Okay, so there are certain people here who are ineligible. Now, this is another interesting point too. Now, these are all laws that are going back and forth, sub-statutes going back and forth over the course of this Qianlong reign. What if the person you killed, if it's a homicide, is the only son of aged parents? Okay, should you be allowed to be pardoned? Well, this goes back and forth too. At one point, they say yes. Okay, you got to take care of your parents. But finally, they come down and say no, which I thought was always kind of interesting too, because now you have two sets of parents that don't have anybody to take care of them, and two lines who don't have anybody to do the veneration. But that was the decision. So, if you're an only son, if you kill somebody who's an only son, then you should not be given this kind of pardon. And then false accusations. The false accusation law itself changes tremendously over the course of the Qianlong reign, and there's all kinds of new conditions put on it. And you would not be automatically executed for a false accusation by any stretch of the imagination. I can guarantee you that. But in this case, if you make a false accusation against somebody, that's your crime, and you destroy their family, the family of that victim, then you should not be eligible because you destroyed their family by your false accusation. You should not, when this is uncovered, you should not be eligible for this kind of pardon. All right. And then the last thing, which is a bit trickier too, when you think about it, how are we going to verify all these things? How are we going to know if your mother's been a chaste widow for 20 years? How are we going to know just how old people are, right? I mean, you don't go down to City Hall and get their birth certificate. So you have to go to the local constables and neighbors and the heads of the clans in the area and get them to verify this. So now you're bringing in a whole other group of people into the judicial process too. And then there are other laws, I won't get into too much detail, but when you can recommend, like, can the provincial governor recommend the pardon, or is this an issue that only the emperor himself can decide? So sometimes there's certain conditions, and then there's an extra document that gets inserted, a jiatian that they put in that has a 2-page summary of why they think the person should be pardoned. But other cases, only the emperor himself can decide. There can't be any recommendation from the lower level officials. So this makes everything a bit more complicated and creates another layers of procedure. So there's also laws about what do you do when the local constable, the neighbors, or the clan heads or something, commits fraud or lies. That's a whole other set of crimes that you have to prosecute. So what's the common thread if you look at these 19 sub-statutes and also the ones that are deleted? They acting with intent, and this is pretty clear across the board. This becomes more and more important. The severity of the violence. And that's pretty common with all capital crimes involving homicides anyway. If I punch you once and you fell down, hit your head and died, I'm probably going to be treated more leniently or considered more leniently. But if I've struck repeated blows, and this gets into great detail, right? Because remember the Washing Away of Wrongs, that great English translation published by the Center for Chinese Studies publications? Yeah, great book with those charts that show you all those body parts you don't have to look up. Well, they will go into the homicide report and say, you struck somebody in an area that could cause a fatal wound. So obviously, you had intent to kill him. And then you have to explain why I didn't know what I was doing. I just swung at him. So anytime it's the severity of the violence, rape is out of bounds. You're not going to get a pardon for that. And then there's a phrase you'll see, violent behavior related to moral order. What is that? Well, it can be lots of things. But that you shouldn't be pardoned for. And then evil thugs who disturb localities. They're off. They're out. They should be ineligible also. But basically, I think what they're trying to do is separate these ignorant and obstinate people from people who they consider to be criminal. And they're also more intent. If you take a homicide case from the early part of Chen Longring and you read it carefully, and you can see the magistrates are trying to work it to give a sympathetic picture. And you'll suddenly see testimony from a 71-year-old father who's quoting some of the most elegant Chinese you ever heard to make his point about how much he's going to suffer and the family is going to be distraught. And you read that, and then you read one from 30, 40 years later where all they're looking at is, okay, he's the only son. Okay, let's look at this case, and he struck them, once or twice, and the guy fell down and died. Okay, he's eligible, right? There's no more of the detail. I mean, that's pretty common with these kind of case records anyway. So I think it's moving towards something that's more about criminality than ideology. The laws over this, this is my last thing. I think I'm out of time anyway. But they're trying to balance the principles that were there in the law, but at the same time try to enforce stricter punishments when they identify people as criminal, not just the poor simpletons. And so this is an ongoing struggle, right? And the more severe punishments are being reserved for more specific acts that are clearly defined or clearly believed to be outrageous, beyond the pale, and they should be punished. Okay, I think I better stop. Yeah. We do questions? Yes, sir. Oh.
Does Qianlong become more hardened in terms of providing release from crimes as he goes on? Does he become more cut and dry and less scholarly?
Well, there's always this contradiction, right? I mean, if you read his statements about law, he's quoting, from the Zhou dynasty commentaries about capital punishment. And he's complaining, though, it's kind of contradictory, right? He's complaining that they're not being strict enough, right? But then he's not checking them off, right? If he puts the red check mark there, that's, ball game's over.
Are there less checks toward the end of the reign than at the beginning?
That I couldn't tell you specifically, but if I look at those lists of how many people are executed, I don't think so, because the numbers really don't change. Now, here's another recent development for me, is finding out that Jupi Zoja have a separate track, right? And they're not routine reports, and those reports you can request to immediately execute somebody under the authority of the emperor. Sometimes there's report then kill. And there are also cases going that way. But and I've only been able to look at like the briefest descriptions, they're usually pretty serious crimes, from the titles in them. So I think there's just this reluctance really to put people to death. I mean, it continues, but they're very bureaucratic on the one hand, and they're very legalistic on the other hand too. Sometimes, right? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for the great presentation. And most of your the cases about individual violence.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how the government look at this collective violence, especially some in the southern provinces like Guangzhou or Fujian. They have the lineage disputes or lineage fields. Mm-hmm. I don't know. This in the Chinese legal culture, the law almost do not. This law doesn't just. Blame the collective violence or not? Is that in your story?
Yeah, I didn't bring that up today, but yes, you could go, into the code and just, look at localities sometimes, right? Because in Guangdong, there's a separate Guangdong. It's Guangdong law on people gathering, I can't remember the exact title, but by rivers and streams or something, in groups and fighting or something. It's something like that that sounds silly, but it's really about feuding and xiado, right? And if that's the case, and I've seen like homicide cases where there's more than a few people involved, and the magistrates are very, very quick to say, you know, this wasn't a feud, right? Which would make them look bad in their situation. So yeah, there are laws about collective violence, yeah, and discussions of it in the Shirlu too, what to do about those cases, yeah.
So I've got the mic and get my attention and I'll bring it over, but because I've got the mic, I'll get to ask a question. It's actually a comment question and then a question.
Okay.
In your presentation, you don't distinguish between the Li that have their origins in sort of bottom-up specific adjudications that are then concretized by a rescript versus Li that are, in a sense, imposed by a unified intelligence. And I wonder if that adds or detracts to your presentation about, you know, a coherent policy being worked out, at least in the criminal law. And the second is a question. Do you see any evidence in your research of intersection between this kind of activity and something like I guess they call it the 8 special procedures, the Buoye, whereby if you have special merit in Confucian terms, you are procedurally immune from what is visited on the heads of the great unwashed. So two questions.
The first question, most of the Li that are involved criminal justice are the ones that are sort of being, you know, proposed and debated and worked out from provincial officials. And you know, if you look at I know you read the Du Li Suiyi, you know, you'll see, right? Somebody proposed that. That's a great way to track things down in the Huidian or in Jupizoja. And you'll get a feel for this discussion amongst officials, right? It's got to be approved, right, eventually. But sometimes those things, you're in between compilations of the code, so they're out there and they could be enforced or applied. But then somebody else from a different province is complaining about that. You know, you see that with the chaste widow thing, right? Because they're going like, no, how do you know, this guy's just going to kill people. Now he knows his mother's a widow. So I think it's more of an ongoing process, right? But the emperor's always got the ultimate say. And then you see, when does it become a ding li, right? Yeah, that's the thing. Does that answer that question? Yeah. Okay. The other thing is, the cases, I don't look at like guanfan, you know, or officials that get involved in crime. So most of the people are the little people, as Chuck Tilley would say. Very rarely would you see anybody who's got any kind of serious status, maybe a gensheng or something like that, yeah. And, you know, I guess that kind of fits with your picture of violence, you know. Wealthy, powerful people hire other people to kill people for them, you know. I mean, maybe I just distorted view from New Jersey, but, you know. Yes, sir.
Oh, thanks. This was really a rewarding talk. So I have one question. I have a million questions, but
Okay.
I'm just going to give you one. So you're talking about the motives behind this policy of leniency, and I sense that there were also doctrinal motives of doctrine or motives of leniency that had to do with the kind of the old hat idea that they were trying to not kill too many people in order to upset the cosmic balance. And that's an old argument between Baden-Morris and Xi Daolin, but also Jiang Yonglin has sort of revived this, and I think also Paul Katz has revived this. So do you see any evidence in the primary sources of any debate on those lines? Or perhaps that's not the right place to look for this, but do you find any kind of evidence that they were concerned about cosmic balance, or?
They still pay lip service to it, you know, but I don't know, so obviously I'm not taking it that seriously. So when they talk about, hey, we can, this type of crime, we can execute them immediately, and then you get a little pushback that says, but it's not the autumn, you know. Well, they'll find a way around that. Like, this guy's serious and he's bad, we got to kill him now. But then you'll also, with this whole discussion of Huanzhe and all the people in the prisons, you'll also see that. But here's an interesting one. This is in the Shirlu, where they said, Qianlong says, okay, yeah, a year ago, we had all these guys in jail, you know, in Beijing, and we let them out, and there was a drought, and we had them digging canals, you know, and that really helped because we got more water into the city. You know, so it's kind of like cosmic order or, you know, free labor. I don't know, you know. I mean, maybe I'm, overthinking it, but it sounds like he managed to work that one into a very practical use, Yeah, let him out of jail. We can dig some canals. Yes, sir.
Nico said, we got it now. Nico said that you were presenting this as a coherent reaction to a problem. I'm not convinced that that's the way that I came away from it, or some of the other people.
Yeah.
So do you see it as a generally coherent reaction to the problems that you outlined?
In the sense that, at the end, there's some threads here that keep coming through. Yeah, but it's not. There's not one single mastermind behind this. Yeah, I think it's more of an interplay of different provincial officials, and I'm more and more convinced. The Qing dynasty is all about innovations. I mean, like pragmatic innovation. They try this, they try that. The tinkering argument. If it doesn't work, try something else. I mean, there's limits to that, but they're looking for solutions, and they're willing to tweak. It's impossible for me to show you all, like even these, at that point in time, that list of 19 sub-statutes, even within that period, there were little tweaks going back and forth, so the more complicated ones. By the time you get to Duly Twingy, there's all kinds of, I guess he's forgotten some of them because, God bless him, he did us a great favor, but, he doesn't track every single one over the years. So, yeah, I see more of that, not a master plan, but a general direction, yeah. The masses are going to swarm or something. We got to get out of here. Is that the? Yeah. That's what I've been told.
Thank you very much. Great job. You mentioned, I think, in the Yongzheng period, where there was a bit of emphasis on actually educating the Rubes on what was a crime and what wasn't. Throughout this, beyond that, how much emphasis at all is there on rehabilitation at all, or re-education through labor, or any sort of carrot rather than just a stick? Thanks.
Yeah, none that I've seen. I mean, because the idea is, if you're in a jail, you're awaiting either being sent to exile or be executed, right? There's not an idea of a prison and a reform system or anything like that. And when it becomes pretty clear through other discussions that once these people are out in they're like exile communities all around, right? And they live amongst themselves, and there's no supervision. And that's when another crime happens. The central government is, what's going on? How come you're not watching these guys? So it seems to me there's no real supervision going on of these convicts. Yeah.
Just a basic question.
Yeah.
What was it like in those local jails? I assume there's a great variety across them.
That's a really good question. So the reason why you know about a death in a jail is that it has to be reported, and it has to be reported by an official from a different county, and they come in. But these are routine reports, and I'm so jaded, right? I've read so many cases. I get it right away. Somebody got sick, and either they caught a cold or they started coughing. We got him some soup. We brought him a doctor. Oh my God! And a couple days later, he died. That's about all you hear about, right? And nobody abused him. Very definitive statements. Just poor guy happened to die, and that's all you really find out about it, right? But I'm wondering too. Yeah, I mean, if somebody can survive 24 years, or even 5 years, or 3 years. Now, when it gets to construction, and I welcome anybody go start researching this. I just saw the documents. I'm not getting into them, but how thick a wall should be, how many stones you need, how deep, I mean, that is, you can get tremendous detail on that, right?
So they were solidly constructed buildings, not just ramshackle things.
If these, yeah, from what's being described in there. Now, they're looking for money to build it. So what actually happened, I don't want to imply that there might have been some corruption going on. But yeah, the way they describe it. Now, this is to hold the serious criminals, right? And from what I've read, and I haven't read a whole lot, the way people are held varies, right? And within a jail, there's an area for the dangerous types, right? And I'm assuming that's where these guys would be. So, but yeah, I imagine it varies place to place. I wish I knew.
One last question.
Yes,
I've got the mic again.
Yes.
Crazy.
Good.
Lawyers or legal scholars would look at this problem and make a strong distinction between procedural norms and substantive norms, or procedural justice and substantive justice.
Yeah.
If I make this proposition to you, true or false, that the tinkering that you see here, other than the pardons, which is absolutely procedural, is it mostly on the side of substantive justice? You don't see any tinkering that changes the procedures that lead to the assignment of criminal guilt, evidence gathering. Obviously, there's no right to counsel, but those kinds of things.
Actually, I love talking to lawyers because they always force me to think more. But yeah, you tell me, what is this? Okay, if you look at a homicide report from Qianlong 4 or something, right? There's all kinds of depositions. There's back and forth cross-examinations, and you can tell sometimes the magistrate's kind of showing off. You know, he's doing this thing like, then I asked him this, then I asked him that, and then I got him to the point where he confessed. Okay. By the time you get to the later Qianlong period, we got so many cases going through there. There's actually rules that come out, start streamlining these reports. What does not disappear from any of these, like homicide reports? The medical forensic. So you can always go back there, and they used to do that when they did their little, elaborate cross-exams, but they can always go back there. If this person's been beaten, struck, hit in all these places, that's evidence that you can't escape from, So what does that mean? They're more procedural? Okay, or less, okay, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Again, and I think this has to be the last one, because then we have to...
My question is, everything's becoming, is it sort of in flux, things are changing, things are being added, subtracted, et cetera. Do we get, it sounds like prime condition for the development of a lawyer. Somebody outside the official system who would get on top of these things. And indeed, officials who are not, or literati who are not officials, something like that. Does anything like that pop up?
It doesn't show up in my sources, but if you go look at the Songshi, the literature on those types of folks, they're usually more involved in property disputes and those kinds of things. I don't know about capital cases. I'm convinced now that there's a big difference between the 19th and the 18th centuries. That things are getting a lot worse in terms of procedures and order and everything else. Not just social order, but also legal order. And I don't know enough about that yet. But in the Jiaqing period, this is when these appeals are being institutionalized, and you've been wrongly accused and things like that can go up the line. Now, are those people getting advice? Probably. And are there handbooks? You could see this vocabulary. Kurosawa's written about this stuff too. There's ways to express things, and everybody knows it. It's no coincidence that you can read. I've read thousands of homicide cases, and you find a lot of language that's just. It's boilerplate, yeah. So who's advising them on that too, So, okay, yeah.
Okay, I think we have to disappear. So Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.